Core stability is a term that gets thrown around a lot, and it goes hand in hand with the idea that your core is made to resist motion. I'm going to break down some of the flaws with this idea of core stability and why it's important to train your core through a full range of motion. Starting off strong, it isn't really a thing. Stability is just an expression of strength and coordination. It isn't magical. It's your body's ability to produce force with a movement while resisting deviations from that movement. So if you have strength and coordination with a movement, then you have a stable core. And stability is largely just a buzzword. It's poorly defined in a biomechanical sense, and I think that it should just be done away with as a term in this sense altogether, because it commonly gets used the same way that medical stability or anatomical stability would get used. This leads to a lot of problems. Anyways, one of the main movements from this whole core stability camp is that your core is made to resist movement, which is just a ridiculous statement. Your core muscles are not sentient. They're skeletal muscles that attach to different bones, and when they contract, it causes those bones to rotate around a joint or a series of joints. That's how muscles work, and your core muscles are no different. If the contraction is stronger than the force that's being applied to you, then it's concentric. If it's the same, it's isometric, and if it's weaker, then it's eccentric. Pretty simple. The only one that'll kind of give an exception to is your transverse abdominis, as that is there to increase intra-abdominal pressure, but the rest have muscle fiber orientations and insertions that result in a moment of force or torque around a joint when they contract, and that can create movement.
You should be doing isometrics because they're what build functional strength better than sit-ups.
Well, the problem with this is that, believe it or not, movement is functional. You have to move to live, and a core that can move is a functional core. And to address the isometrics, if you aren't seeing gains when you're doing dynamic exercises and then you switch to doing isometrics and you start to see a lot more gains, that's because you weren't loading the dynamic exercises enough. I see this all the time. Someone who can throw around hundreds of pounds thinks that doing 20 sit-ups is sufficient ab work. And then they wonder why they aren't making gains. Then they see some BS that isometrics are actually a better way to train the core, and they load them up and take them close to failure and start training them much better and actually start seeing gains. Yeah, no duh. That would be like doing curls with 142 reps in reserve and then wondering why your biceps aren't getting any bigger or stronger. Then you go on and you do some rows and you do them to failure, and you're like, wow, I'm starting to make all these bicep gains. So you conclude that rows are better than curls for biceps. It just isn't an equal comparison, and it has a feedback loop with this stupid dogma that your core is made to resist motion, because people continue to train poorly with dynamic exercises and then actually load up their isometrics so they get better gains. It's not actually better. You're just doing one very poorly. You have to load your core training heavy enough and take it close enough to failure if you want to see some serious gains. Like I said earlier, your core muscles are skeletal muscles, just like all the other muscles that you train. So you have to train them in a similar way. Like, I'm actually getting mad at this. Like, do people not take a second to apply any critical thought to something that they hear? Okay, for those of you with critical thought that are still around, thank you. And now I'm going to go over some of my favorite ways to train the core muscles. Starting off, I like to do full range sit-ups to hit the rectus abdominis. I use a bench setup for this, but you can use a GHD if you have access to one. I personally use a bench that has a bar so I can hook my feet under it, and then I use weights to weigh the bench down so it doesn't move. Other ways you can pin your feet down are using a squat rack, using a barbell, some dumbbells, anything that won't move when you actually put force against it. Also, I suggest using your forefoot as the point of contact rather than your midfoot, because that's a lot more comfortable. And you also get a little bit of a tib ant workout and stretch as a bonus if you care about that at all. Then after that, I sit on a bench, and I actually like to use a foam pad because it increases the range of motion and makes it a little bit more comfortable. Sometimes I have the bench set up right under my cheeks so that the focus is mostly on my abs, and sometimes I move the bench down a little bit so it's just at the bottom part of my cheeks, and then I get a little bit more movement for the hips and a little bit more work on the hip flexors. Both of these feel great, and there's not too much difference between them, so I usually just go with whatever I'm feeling like on the day without too much thought put behind it. Now that I'm set up, I grab a weight that makes it hard to do more than 10 reps and get after it. Your abs are skeletal muscles, so you have to train them just like you would any other muscle. Push them hard and take them close to failure, and you'll get gains. I like to use a plate and hold it around my collarbone or my forehead, but you can use whatever you feel most comfortable with and allows you to challenge yourself. Your abdominal muscles are also made up of your obliques, so for these I like to do twists and side bends. Both of these movements have similar muscles as their prime movers, but coordinating the different movements and the different accessory muscles worked make doing each of these beneficial in their own way. So starting off with the twists, I hook my feet under a bench just like I do with the full range sit-up, so all that previous advice also applies here. After that, it's as simple as sitting on the ground, holding a weight, and twisting back and forth. I like to hold the weight with somewhat outstretched arms because that really increases the tension at the end ranges because it makes that moment arm huge. If only I could make my little moment arm huge. This will lead to some immaculate stimulation and gains. Moving on to side bends, just like with the twist, they're great for hitting the obliques, but these are also great for hitting the QL. I think this muscle can be a little bit overhyped sometimes, but it's still really good to work it. The main problem with the training of this muscle is usually that it's just some underloaded rehab BS that people do, so it doesn't sufficiently challenge the muscle to actually make some serious strength and size gains. And when people do side bends, they typically underload these as well. They'll pick a dumbbell or a kettlebell that they can do reps with from sun up till sundown. You're not going to make gains if you're working at 50 reps in reserve. So when I'm doing side bends, I like to use a barbell so that I can load it up heavy and really hit those muscles hard. Find the center of the bar by using the center knurling and then stand up with it and start bending to the side. If you don't have a bar with center knurling, then you can use these side knurlings and your fingers as measurements to kind of guesstimate the center better than just completely guessing. Or if you own the bar, then you can measure out the center point ahead of time and mark it with tape. And more often than not, when doing this exercise, you'll probably be slightly off center and the bar will tip, but that's okay as long as it's not completely cutting off your range of motion. You don't have to be perfect with it. And in fact, you should just stop trying to be perfect altogether. Your lifts and your life will become much better. And if you need a little bit more of an in-depth guide, then I have a whole video going over side bends that I'll link in the description. And finally, I like to work the erectors and the other muscles around the spine by doing deadlifts and some kind of Zercher deadlift. Deadlifts are pretty straightforward. You get strong with these and you'll build some thick and juicy erectors. And then adding in some Zercher deadlifts, Jeffersons, or Zercher RDLs will be a great way to get those deeper ranges of flexion and get strong in those awkward positions. These can be really helpful if you have to get into more bent over positions and produce force there, which honestly, people have to do in their lives all the time. So I think having a base of strength and range there is very important for everyone. And if you do sports that involve grappling or rowing, then these movements are going to be extremely beneficial for you because you have to get into those deep ranges of flexion and produce force there all the time. So don't skip out on your Zerchers. And to keep it specific to lifting, then having that extra range and capacity will make deadlifts a lot better and keep your back stronger and more resilient. You'll probably also be able to train harder and more often because your back won't be as tired all the time. And they also have a pretty good carryover to a lot of strongman movements like stone lifts and old-time strongman movements as well. So the accessibility and payoff from Zerchers just make them a spectacular exercise to do. I love them and can't recommend them enough. And instead of talking about them here, I have a whole video going over them. So I'll link that down in the description that you can check out after this video. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions or you want to share your successes with any of these lifts, then please comment them down below. Now go out there and make some gains.